In the quiet town of Willowbrook, Ohio, Thomas Henderson was a man everyone admired. At 42, he was a successful real estate developer, known for his charm and his willingness to help the community. On the surface, Thomas had it all: a thriving business, a beautiful wife, Evelyn, and a lovely stepdaughter, Grace, who was just about to turn 18. The three of them lived in a grand, secluded house on the outskirts of town, projecting the image of a perfect family. Thomas had met Evelyn 5 years ago at a fundraiser. Evelyn, then a 38-year-old single mother, was running a boutique and juggling life as a mother to Grace, who was then 13. Evelyn was captivated by Thomas's confidence and kindness, especially his seemingly genuine interest in her daughter's well-being. He quickly became a father figure to Grace, attending her school events, helping with her homework, and offering her the kind of stability she had missed growing up without her biological father. Thomas and Evelyn's relationship progressed quickly. Within months, Thomas proposed, and they were married in a small private ceremony. Grace, shy but grateful for the attention from her new stepfather, welcomed Thomas into her life. The family seemed to thrive. Evelyn was happy, Grace excelled in her studies, and Thomas continued to grow his business, expanding his influence and reputation. Yet behind closed doors, things were not as perfect as they seemed. As Thomas's business grew, his time at home diminished. He often stayed late at the office, citing to work as his excuse. Evelyn noticed his growing detachment but brushed it off as the price of success. Grace, on the other hand, saw more than her mother did. She noticed how Thomas's gaze lingered a bit too long, how his compliments about her appearance became more personal. But Grace, eager to please and for the approval she had never received from her absent father, didn't question it. As the months passed, Thomas's relationship with Grace became increasingly complicated. He would offer her rides to her after-school activities, take her shopping, and even invite her to his office under the guise of teaching her about business. To outsiders, he was just an involved stepfather, but to Grace, these interactions were beginning to feel different. There was an unspoken tension, an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite name, but could certainly feel. One evening, after dropping Grace off at her part-time job, Thomas made a comment about how much she had grown up. It was a harmless remark on the surface, but the way he said it with a lingering smile sent a shiver down Grace's spine. She found herself torn between discomfort and the thrill of his attention. The boundary between fatherly affection and something more had been crossed, though neither acknowledged it outright. Evelyn, blissfully unaware of the growing closeness between her husband and her daughter, continued to manage the household and support Thomas's demanding career. She believed that their occasional arguments and Thomas's late hours were just bumps in the road. However, as Grace became more withdrawn and Thomas's absences grew longer, Evelyn couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. But she pushed the feeling aside, trusting in the family they had built together. As Grace's high school graduation approached, Thomas's behavior became more unpredictable. He began texting Grace late at night under the pretense of checking in on her. The messages, initially innocent, quickly grew more intimate. Grace, grappling with her own emotions and conflicted by the attention she craved, responded in kind. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that neither was fully prepared to face the consequences of. As summer approached, the Henderson household began to crack under the pressure of hidden secrets. Thomas and Grace's interactions, once seemingly innocent, had crossed lines neither of them could deny. They exchanged long glances, shared secret smiles, and spent more time together under the pretext of bonding. Grace's admiration for Thomas had morphed into a confusing mix of affection and guilt, and Thomas, fueled by his desire and sense of control, continued to blur the boundaries. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Thomas offered to drive Grace to a late-night study group. Evelyn, preoccupied with planning Grace's graduation party, barely noticed when they left. As they drove in silence, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Grace stared out the window, lost in thought, until Thomas broke the silence. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman, Grace. You know that, right?" The compliment, delivered with a tone far too intimate for a stepfather, hung in the air. Grace turned to look at him, unsure of how to respond. Thomas reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and Grace felt her heart race. This was no longer about approval or paternal care. It was something much darker, something that made Grace feel both wanted and trapped. That night marked a turning point. Thomas and Grace began to meet in secret, often under the guise of study sessions or errands. Their relationship became a tangled web of hidden messages, stolen glances, and moments of intimacy that Grace knew were wrong but felt powerless to stop. Thomas's manipulative hold over her tightened, and Grace, torn between loyalty to her mother and her misguided feelings for Thomas, found herself deeper in a situation she couldn't control. Evelyn, meanwhile, started noticing subtle changes. Thomas was more attentive to Grace than ever, often in ways that seemed excessive for a stepfather. Grace, once outgoing and vibrant, had become withdrawn and secretive. The two would share quiet conversations that abruptly ended when Evelyn entered the room, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being kept on the outside of something important. The final straw came one night when Evelyn accidentally saw a message flash on Grace's phone. "Can't wait to see you tonight. T." Her heart sank. She didn't need to know the context to feel the weight of betrayal. Evelyn's mind raced as she pieced together the strange behavior, the late-night trips and the whispered conversations. The unthinkable had been happening right under her nose. Determined to find answers, Evelyn began to keep a closer eye on Thomas and Grace. She checked phone logs, scrutinized their interactions, and watched their every move. The more she observed, the clearer the picture became. The betrayal was real, and it was far worse than she had imagined. Thomas was not just cheating, he was crossing boundaries that no man should ever cross. One afternoon, while Thomas was at work, Evelyn confronted Grace in her bedroom. The young girl, who had been pretending to study, looked up with a mix of fear and defiance. Evelyn's voice trembled as she demanded to know the truth. "What's going on between you and Thomas?" Grace hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. "Mom, it's not what you think," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Evelyn's patience snapped. She grabbed Grace's phone and scrolled through the messages, each one more damning than the last. The truth was laid bare: secret rendezvous, declarations of love, and plans to meet up when Evelyn wasn't around. Evelyn's world crumbled in an instant. The husband she had trusted and the daughter she had raised had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. Consumed by a mix of rage, heartbreak, and disbelief, Evelyn stormed out of the house, her mind reeling from the enormity of the deceit. Evelyn drove aimlessly for hours, her mind flooded with a whirlwind of emotions. She replayed every moment of the past few months, searching for the signs she had missed. The betrayal cut deeper than any pain she had ever known. Her husband, the man who was supposed to protect their family, had preyed on her daughter. Evelyn's anger simmered, fueled by the helplessness of the situation. When Evelyn finally returned home, it was late. Thomas was in the living room, sipping a glass of whiskey as if nothing had changed. Grace was nowhere to be seen. Evelyn's entrance was met with a casual greeting, but she didn't respond. She walked straight to Thomas, her eyes burning with fury. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Thomas, sensing the shift in her tone, set his glass down. "What's going on, Evelyn?" he asked, trying to maintain his usual calm demeanor. But Evelyn's silence was deafening, and as she pulled out Grace's phone, displaying the messages, Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to panic. "You've been sleeping with my daughter," Evelyn spat, her voice breaking with a mix of rage and anguish. Thomas tried to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. He stammered, grasping for excuses, but Evelyn wouldn't let him escape. She hurled accusations, her words fueled by all the pain she had kept bottled up. Grace, hearing the commotion, appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale and tear-streaked. She watched in horror as her mother unleashed years of repressed emotion on Thomas. Thomas tried to downplay his actions, painting himself as a man who had simply lost his way, but Evelyn was beyond reasoning. "You were supposed to protect her," Evelyn screamed. "You were supposed to protect us." The confrontation escalated quickly. Thomas, desperate to regain control, turned the blame onto Grace, accusing her of leading him on, of making it impossible for him to resist. Grace's shock turned to devastation as she realized that Thomas was willing to sacrifice her to save himself, the man she had mistakenly trusted. "You're disgusting," Grace whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at Thomas. "I was just a kid looking for a father." Thomas's attempts at damage control only made things worse. He begged Evelyn for forgiveness, insisting that he had made a terrible mistake, that he loved their family, but his words were empty. Evelyn's heart hardened with every syllable. In her eyes, Thomas had ruined everything she held dear, and there was no going back. The shouting match continued, spiraling into chaos. Evelyn's anger, Grace's shame, and Thomas's desperate lies collided, turning their once serene home into a battleground of shattered trust and broken promises. In a fit of rage, Evelyn shoved Thomas, sending his glass crashing to the floor. "Get out!" she screamed, pointing toward the door. "I don't ever want to see you again." Thomas hesitated, his pride and fear warring within him. He looked to Grace, but she turned away, tears streaming down her face. He had lost them both, and he knew it. Grabbing his coat, Thomas stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The house fell silent, save for the sound of Evelyn's sobs echoing through the empty space. Grace approached her mother, wanting to comfort her, but Evelyn recoiled. The bond between them, once unbreakable, now felt like a fragile thread. Evelyn couldn't bring herself to look at her daughter, unable to separate Grace's role as a victim from her part in the deception. They were both trapped in the fallout of Thomas's betrayal, and neither knew how to move forward. That night, Evelyn and Grace slept in separate rooms, each grappling with the overwhelming reality of their shattered family. The illusion of their perfect life was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of loss and betrayal. The days following the explosive confrontation were a blur of grief and anger. Evelyn barely spoke to Grace, avoiding eye contact and withdrawing into herself. Grace, racked with guilt and shame, tried to apologize, but her words felt hollow. Evelyn couldn't bear to listen. She spent hours staring blankly at old family photos, each one now a painful reminder of what they had lost. Thomas, too ashamed to return home, stayed in a hotel across town. He made sporadic attempts to reach out, but Evelyn ignored his calls. He sent messages filled with apologies and empty promises, but there was no undoing the damage. Thomas's absence should have brought relief, but instead, it only intensified the emptiness that now filled the house. One stormy evening, Thomas returned unannounced. Evelyn was in the kitchen, staring out the window, lost in thought when she heard the door open. The rain pounded against the roof, masking the sound of his footsteps. He called out, his voice strained and desperate. Evelyn stiffened, her anger boiling to the surface once more. She had told him to leave, and now he was back as if nothing had happened. Thomas stepped into the kitchen, drenched from the rain, his eyes pleading. "Evelyn, please, I just want to talk," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. Evelyn, still gripping a kitchen knife she had been using to prepare dinner, turned to face him. The sight of Thomas standing there, unrepentant and pitiful, ignited her fury. "I don't want to hear anything you have to say," Evelyn snapped, her voice shaking. But Thomas persisted, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of their relationship. He talked about his mistakes, his regrets. Evelyn heard nothing but excuses. As his words droned on, Evelyn's vision blurred with tears of frustration and pain. In a moment of sheer anguish, she raised the knife, her grip tightening as every betrayal flashed through her mind. "You ruined everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. Thomas stepped back, his eyes widening in fear, but he was too slow. Evelyn lunged, the knife piercing through the thin fabric of his shirt. Thomas gasped, clutching his side as he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Evelyn, overcome by a mixture of rage and sorrow, struck again and again. Each thrust was fueled by the depth of her heartbreak, the pain of being deceived by the two people she loved most. Blood splattered across the kitchen tiles, and the room filled with the sickening sound of steel meeting flesh. Grace, hearing the commotion, rushed downstairs. She froze at the sight of her mother standing over Thomas's crumpled body, the knife still in her trembling hands. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and family meals, was now stained with blood and horror. Grace's scream pierced the air, snapping Evelyn out of her rage. Evelyn dropped the knife, her hands shaking as she realized what she had done. Thomas lay motionless on the floor, his eyes vacant and unseeing. The man who had once been the center of their world was now gone, his life extinguished in a violent burst of fury. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, overcome by the weight of her actions. Grace ran to her stepfather's side, her tears mixing with the blood on the floor. She fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher's voice was a distant hum in her ear as she tried to explain what had happened. Moments later, the wail of sirens echoed through the storm, signaling the end of the nightmare that had consumed their lives. The police arrived and the scene was immediately secured. Evelyn, dazed and unresponsive, was taken into custody. She offered no resistance, her eyes vacant as the officers led her away. Grace, left behind in the chaotic aftermath, was left to grapple with the devastation that now defined her reality. The trial was swift and highly publicized, with the media painting Evelyn as a woman pushed to the brink by betrayal and heartbreak. The evidence was overwhelming, and despite the defense's arguments of temporary insanity, Evelyn was convicted of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 15. Grace, now alone and burdened by the weight of her involvement, struggled to rebuild her life. She moved away from Willowbrook, seeking anonymity in a city where no one knew her story. But the scars of that night stayed with her, a constant reminder of the price of betrayal and the fragility of trust. In the end, the Henderson family was remembered not for their success or the illusion of a perfect life, but for the tragic, irreversible choices that tore them apart. Their story became a cautionary tale of how easily the lines between love, desire, and destruction can blur, leaving nothing but heartbreak in their wake.